Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Okay, welcome again to the Gay Buddhist Fellowship. This is the time we go around the room and introduce ourselves. My name is Jay Corbett.
My name is Chris Sands.
I'm Scott.
I'm Peter.
Charles. Rob.
Sweet.
Vinny.
My name's David.
My name's Gary.
My name's Michael.
My name is Henry.
David.
Joe.
Victor.
Peter.
Paul Shepherd.
Anthony.
My name's Tom.
My name is Ray Dyer.
My name's Lee Robbins.
Michael.
Jack. My name is David.
Todd Tony.
Barbie.
Wait.
My name is Harley.
My name is Cass.
I'm Richard Lane.
Peter. Patrick.
Larry Friesen.
George.
And I am Don Mohidin.
Is anyone here for the first or second time? So you're most welcome. Please stay after the talk for tea and snacks for a social hour or a half hour. So today our speaker is a Sangha member, Don Mohidin, and Don will give us a talk about his, he's been practicing Buddhism for 6 years, and he'll tell us a story of how his life revealed certain truths which he later learned to be principles of the Dharma. Please welcome Don.
Well, I'd like to thank the Sangha, begin by thanking the Sangha for this opportunity to speak. This is a rather intimidating position. It's not normal for me, but I hope you'll bear with me. At any rate, before I get started, I'd like to recognize two very dear friends that have joined us today. Tom Nolan, who is Executive Director of Project Open Hand, and some of you may know that they provide hot meals every day for people with AIDS. And his partner, Larry Friesen, who's an architect. And they're very, very long-term dear friends, and I hope that before we all leave today that you can greet them and make them feel welcome. Well, everybody has a story, and I think there's some value in sharing our stories, especially within the context of Sangha, because this is an opportunity for us to get to know each other a little better, to sort of deepen our friendships and kind of go beyond the pleasantries that we exchange out there with tea every week. And it's in that spirit that I offer this talk. And so as Jay mentioned, that a number of throughout my early life, I came to some realizations about truths that I later learned were elements and truths of the Dharma. Now, realizing these truths did not come about because of any special insight into the Dharma. I don't possess that, but it just turned out that the way events in my life unfolded, that many of these truths just became obvious. And then I later learned that they're part of a whole mechanism of the Dharma. And in the earlier years, I didn't figure out how to put any of that together. They were just these sort of disparate pieces of knowledge. So to begin with, I'd like to talk about the law of cause and effect, or karma. And early on in my life, actually before I was born, there was a decision made by two people whom I did not know, and those decisions were to have a profound effect upon my life and on the life of many others. And those two people were my maternal grandparents. And the decision, which was to become a cause and have many effects, was their decision to marry and to travel to India to become missionaries. In their words, they were traveling to India to bring the light of the Gospels to the heathen masses in India that were living in darkness. So, around the turn of the last century, they traveled to India and built a mission in northwest India in a small town called Chhapra, which is situated on the banks of the Ganges River. So they had 6 children. My mother was one of them. And all of those children went on to become missionaries as adults, except my mother. She was the kind of rebel in the family, and instead of going out and becoming a missionary, she met my father, who was a Kashmiri man, and they lived up in Kashmir in the northern part of India. Kashmir has been described by many Westerners as paradise on earth. It's situated at the foothills of the Himalaya Mountains. They lived on a houseboat, which reflected the Himalaya Mountains off into the background. However, the marriage was anything but paradisical. and between them, they had 4 children, of which I was the last. And by the time my mother was pregnant with me, my parents were in the process of divorcing. So my mother decided to go back to my grandmother's mission and have me. But at this point, something I should have said earlier was that early on in the last century, there was a smallpox epidemic in India, and it hit India hard, as well as many other parts of the world. And my grandfather believed that taking a vaccination demonstrated a lack of faith that God would protect him. Well, he did come down with smallpox, and 2 weeks later he was dead. So my grandmother raised the 6 children, built the mission, and it was in this context that my mother went on to meet my father, and then came back after my parents divorced, and I was arrived in the mission compound on the banks of the Ganges River, and another brown baby was not a source of joy at that time. My grandmother referred to my father as that Mohammedan. So it was not exactly a welcome sight to see a brown baby show up at the mission compound. Well, soon after I was born, my siblings were staying with family members in various parts of northern India, and my mother decided that we were all going to go to America. So we traveled to Calcutta and received British Indian passports and American visas, and then our entire family traveled across India from Calcutta to Bombay, and the mission had an airplane. My grandmother's mission had an airplane that would ferry missionaries to and from their stations, between America and their stations. So we met up with that plane in Calcutta, along with a number of other missionaries, and so our first leg of the journey was across the Arabian Sea from Bombay to Djibouti on the east coast of Africa. We then went to Kenya and stayed there a couple of weeks because the plane broke down and we were waiting for parts. So once we were underway again, we went to Liberia and Monrovia on the western coast of Africa, and then traveled across the Atlantic to Trinidad and Tobago. Usually these flights were one a day. This was over a period of several weeks. And so when I was at the ripe age of 3 months old, I entered the United States in Miami, Florida, with my family. And that's how I ended up in America. So My mother had no means to support 4 children, so the mission had arranged for my 2 older sisters to be placed in an orphanage in New Britain, Connecticut. And this was an orphanage run by fundamentalist Christians. Now, the orphanage did not accept children under 3 years of age, so I was placed with a family in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. My brother, who was also under 3 years, was placed with a family in Grand Forks in North Dakota. Well, by the time, my brother and I are very, very, very different individuals, and one of the things that differentiates us is that he has a near photographic memory, and I have a terrible memory. There's large blocks of my life that I have no recollection of and only know about because people have told me about them later. So when my brother was 3 and eligible to be placed in the orphanage, a woman came to his home and said that she was his mother and was going to take him away from who he thought was his mommy and daddy. So they traveled by train, and he cried the entire way across the country, and by the time he arrived in Connecticut, he was convinced that this woman was his mother who immediately abandoned him again into the orphanage. So he had a vivid memory of that experience. And a few years later, when I was 3, the same thing happened to me, but I have no memory of it. So those differences are sometimes a curse or sometimes a blessing. I think in my case, mine was a blessing. So let's see if I can kind of catch up here. So the Klingberg Children's Home was run by the Reverend Haddon Klingberg, and it was a fundamentalist Christian organization, and they maintained discipline with an iron fist. And twice a day we would gather. Boys were separated from the girls in a playroom, and there would be these daily beatings for disciplinary purposes. So we would all sit together and watch as kids would get beat every day, twice a day. And sometimes, the Reverend Haddon Klingberg would kind of lose it. And I could see such intense anger on his face as he would paddle and sometimes break the paddles on these black and blue behinds of these young kids. So that was part of how they maintained discipline. And one morning, every morning we would, after chapel, and chapel was girls sit on one side, boys sit on the other. And during all the years that I lived there, I was not allowed to speak with my sisters. Boys were not allowed to speak with girls. Girls were not allowed to speak with boys. But one morning after chapel, just as we did every morning, we were down in the basement of the building, and we were lined up in single file, waiting for our turn to brush our teeth in the bathroom. And this daily routine was single file, and we were to do this in silence. And this was in a long concrete hallways, concrete floor, and a painted brick wall, and every so many feet there were dim single light bulbs hanging down from the ceiling. And so I can remember one morning we were doing this, and a boy named Craig, who was standing about three boys in front of me, whispered something to the kid in front of him. And the person who was looking after us detected that and placed his hands around his head and smashed his head into the brick wall. And the kid collapsed down onto the floor. The man then leaned over, grabbed it, and said, "You're faking, I know you're faking." And I didn't see that kid for a very long time. Another way, excuse me for collect myself a bit. Another way they maintained discipline was called a lockup. And it was a very small broom closet which was situated on on the edge of the boys' dormitory. And it was about 1.5 feet square, just enough room for a child to stand in that room. And the child would be locked up there anywhere from 5 to 7 days. Could not sit, they could not change position, they had no access to food, no access to water, no access to personal hygiene. And one of the ways that discipline was maintained is when those 5 to 7 days were over, we were all gathered in front of that door when it was opened, and we watched the boy collapse out onto the floor. It's a very, very effective means of discipline. Very cruel, but very effective. So I had a desire for something better, obviously. I didn't know what that was. I had no clue as to what the world was like outside of this orphanage. And I just knew that there was something better, and I wanted it. So every Sunday afternoon after church, we had the opportunity, every 2 weeks on Sunday afternoons, we had the opportunity of leaving the children's home. Not all of the kids there were orphans, like my family. And if you had someone that took an interest in a child, they were allowed to leave the orphanage on Sunday afternoons for about 3 hours. And my mother had a friend whom we all called Aunt Hillary, and she was devoted to our family. She was a very, very loving individual and, a rich part of my life. And every 2 weeks on Sunday afternoon, she would drive up to top of the hill, the orphanage, and collect us kids and take us someplace. And so this is a, I'm kind of missing the Dharma point, but part of what I was saying earlier was that one of the lessons I learned is that suffering is integral to life. It's just part and parcel of life. But getting back to the Sunday excursion, and this was a lesson in karma, how causes have effects, and often these effects, manifest in ways that we have no ways of knowing how it's going to be, and sometimes the best intentioned efforts have effects that we don't know about. So my friend, or a family friend, Aunt Hildy, knew this family that lived in West Hartford, Connecticut, and they invited us one afternoon to go visit their family. And they had a young son that was about my age, and so my sister's brother and I, we followed this kid down to a recreation room in their basement, and my mother and Aunt Hildy were upstairs with the parents talking. So the kid showed us his toys, and we were pretty impressed. And he walked up to the television and turned it on and switched to channels, which was, like totally foreign to us. It's like, what? And he said, "Yeah, I can watch any channel I want." And so we were pretty impressed. So eventually we were called to walk up the stairs, and I followed the young boy, the son of that family. And when we reached the top of the landing, his father opened up the door and put his hands around his son's head. And I had an immediate flashback of Craig's head being smashed into that brick wall. But instead of anything like that happening, the father bent over and kissed his son on the top of the head, picked him up in his arms, and we all went into the kitchen and had ice cream and cake. So, for me, I had seen the promised land. I now knew that it was possible, that a kid could be happy. He could live with a family with parents that loved him, and I wanted that. And from that day forward, even with the best of intentions of that family, my life turned to utter despair and misery, because I now desired what that kid had. And that burned despair into me, just the way a brand, burns a scar into the hide of cattle. And the lesson that I learned from that is desire causes suffering, and great desire causes great suffering. So that great desire to be where I knew I could never be was the cause of great suffering. Well, it turns out that the years kind of slogged down in this awful environment, and by the time my sisters were in high school, they would walk to school, and the path that my mother took to go to work would sometimes cross that path. And so they would occasionally speak to each other on their way to their destinations for the day. Well, it turns out that Haddon Klingberg would ride his empty car around to make sure all of his charges were in order. And one day he saw my mother talking to my sisters and ended up calling my mother and telling her that she should not do that. So my mother got real upset and used that as the impetus to spring us all from the home. So here I am. I'm about 11 years old now, and we all go to live in this 3-story walk-up, and we're on welfare and dirt poor. But that didn't go very well either. And eventually my mother kicked out all of the kids, and I was the last to go. And so by the time I got to high school, I was living in a YMCA and working at night, pumping gas. And just making enough money to afford that 35-cent school lunch. And so that was a difficult time, but I was on my own now, and thought, okay, I've got a handle on this, I've got control. Well, things are impermanent. Things don't last. And one morning, a friend of mine used to drive me to school, and we got broadsided by a car. It was a 55 Chevy with a bunch of high school students, and broadsided our car. And the car slid across the road, and we ran into a wrought iron fence. So I ended up in the hospital with a fairly bad back injury. So here I am. I'm in the hospital, strapped in a bed, and the doctors have just told me that you can't work for several months. And I'm thinking, oh God, now what am I going to do now? No home, no place to go, no money, no way to make money. And as I sat there sort of counting the holes in the ceiling tiles, figuring out, all right, this is a tough time. You got to figure out what to do. Well, it turns out that I was attending church in those days on Sundays. It was a Christian church, and the family found out about my situation. And I went to live with them for my last year in high school. They were very nice people. And then after that, I went in the Army for 3 years and managed to stay out of Vietnam. And so that was a kind of a rough beginning. And it turned out that the lessons I learned was that things in life are impermanent. They don't last. And also, when you think you've got something solid to stand on, something to hold on to, your own ability to take care of yourself, that can be gone in an instant. And that we really have nothing solid to hang on to. That the truth of emptiness is that there's nothing there. So after I got out of the Army, and I'd taken some electronics courses and did some night school, and I was fixing audio equipment, and one of the things I used to do on weekends was to ride my bicycle and this was in Northern Virginia, into D.C. And in those days, in the early 70s, Georgetown was the hangout for hippies. So I didn't ride my bike through Georgetown. I walked through because I liked hippies then and now. And it turns out that I met this young man. He was the archetypal hippie, long blonde hair, selling his artwork on the sidewalk. Beautiful man. And we became friends. I would see him regularly out there selling his art. And so eventually, we became roommates and got an apartment together. And he had just come out just before we met. And I was in the process of coming out just after we moved in together. We weren't lovers, but we ended up becoming very, very close friends. And his name was Tom, and he's been variously described by people that knew him as someone who walked the earth differently than most people. He was a very warm and caring individual, and he had character traits that I so admired and wanted to emulate. And I have to say that whatever humanity I possess, I think I learned from Tom, and he was a very rich part of my life. And we knew each other for 22 years. And eventually he contracted AIDS, and the last 2 years of his life he had dementia. And I sat by his bed and held his hand in the hospital room when he drew his last breath. And integral to life is suffering, and everything is impermanent. So he was a rich part of my life and a very, very dear person. Well, I kind of just went onto the career track and did electronics. I worked for the government in an oceanographic laboratory designing oceanographic instruments for a while, and did that for a few years. And then Reagan became president and started cutting government spending, and so the lab that I worked at closed. And so I went to work for the University of New Hampshire doing the same thing, building oceanographic instruments. And they were funded by a National Science Foundation grant, and Reagan shut that down, and so here I am out of a job again. So after that, I ended up working for the Space Telescope Science Institute in Baltimore, Maryland. I was living in D.C. at the time. And this was before the satellite launched, and was working on a system of digitizing and making computer records of stars that were eventually used in the guidance system of the telescope. So that turned out to be really interesting work, and I love that. And then after that, I went to work for I moved down to Virginia. I had a partner by then who was alcoholic, and so he decided to go into treatment, and we were going to move out of D.C. because he wanted to be away from the environment that created that alcoholism. So we moved down to Roanoke, Virginia, where it was Tom's old hometown. This is before he died, and I went to work for a fiber optics communications company, doing engineering work. Now they had a lot of government contracts, and a lot of them were from the military and defense industry. And eventually I became disillusioned with doing that kind of work. And after I got back from a trip out to Dugway Proving Grounds out there in the desert where they build all kinds of horrific weapons, I looked in the mirror one morning and said, yeah, I don't want to do this anymore. So I was project manager of a job at the time, and so I finished up the job and made sure that the company if had that project done, and then I quit. And I spent a year and bought some land and built a cabin out in the woods. I spent a year reading, and I read literature, philosophy, religion, fiction, nonfiction, just mind candy, serious stuff. And it was during that time when I became acquainted with Buddhism, because part of that year of reading was reading about various religions and traditions, and that's how I came to Buddhism, was initially through that reading. And it was during that time when some of the experiences that I had learned about suffering and impermanence and karma started to pull together. And so after that, I couldn't do that indefinitely, so I went to work for a social services agency in their MIS department for a few years, and then on to a cable company. By now, I'm in my mid-50s, and there's a recession on. And I started noticing that other mid-level managers and engineers are starting to be let go, And these were people that had been with the company for many years, had sterling work records, and all of a sudden, they're out of jobs. So I kind of saw the writing on the wall and prepared for it. And, got about 8 months worth of savings, squirreled away in the bank, and, had a retirement fund and 401k and the land and all of that. And thought, okay, I'm being prudent here. I have no debt. I'm ready in case I lose my job. And of course, eventually I did lose that job. And it was soon after that I experienced a very serious heart attack. And that night I was rushed to the hospital and laying on the table there in a very, very intense pain while the doctor ran tubes up my arteries and trying to open up the veins in my heart. And a few days before that, this was back when I actually owned a television, I had watched a documentary it was about Ram Dass, Richard Alpert, and the documentary, I don't know if any of you have seen it, it was called Fierce Grace. And in that documentary, Ram Dass talks about his experience of having a stroke and how his life up to that point had been the spiritual journey, but while he was experiencing that stroke, he was not in a spiritual space. And later on, he reflected on that. So while I was in the hospital there in this very, very intense pain, pumped up with morphine, I started thinking about that documentary and how I could be in a spiritual space. And this is crazy because up until the point when I thought about that, it didn't occur to me that I might not make it through the night. Here I am with a heart attack and the doctors are doing all this stuff. And so I finally realized that and said, well, you might not live till morning. And I came to peace with that possibility of death and decided to make that a spiritual moment, to have that become something that I could put the spiritual lessons that I'd learned earlier into some kind of practice. Well, I did make it through the next morning, obviously, but ended up with a very damaged heart. And so that made some serious changes in my life again. And so here I thought I was well prepared. I had the savings, but then I've been told now you're 100% disabled, you can't work anymore. So during the couple years it took for the government to actually prove my disability, virtually everything I had worked for my entire life, poof, was gone. Pharmaceutical companies and the doctors have it all now. So again, suffering is an integral part of life, and everything is impermanent. Everything is, can just disappear overnight. And so these were lessons that, as I said, were not due to any kind of spiritual insight on my part. These were life lessons that just became obvious. So eventually I came back to California, where I lived here in the 70s for about a year. And my very dear friends, Tom and Larry, have been instrumental in making that happen. And I can't really express the countless acts of friendship and love and caring that they express. And I'll tell you a quick story of just one of those, because there are so many. A while back, I was up in Guerneville and had to be rushed to the emergency room in Santa Rosa. My heart was beating very, very erratically, and it was a half-hour ride to the hospital. And my lungs started filling up with fluid. And by the time I got to the emergency room, I was in pretty bad shape. Well, they rolled me in, and there was this group of people around the desk, and these two nurses on both sides started cutting off all my clothes so they could attach the monitoring equipment and put the IVs and the oxygen and all of that on. Well, it wasn't long after I was stabilized that Tom and Larry learned about that experience. And so what did they do? They did what any self-respecting gay person would do in that situation. They went shopping. So after a long day's work, they made the 2-hour drive from San Francisco up to Santa Rosa. And I had new sweats and socks and shirts and bathrobe and a whole set of clothes and personal hygiene and all these wonderful things. And I have to say that, the joy that comes from that kind of love, and it's not that you got all this wonderful stuff, and it was, it's true what they say, it was wonderful stuff. Gay people really do know how to shop. It was wonderful stuff. But it wasn't the stuff, it was the fact that underlying that, those acts of kindness, which constantly occur, this is just one of countless numbers of them, the basis is love, it's caring, it's friendship. And when you're on the receiving end of those, it really brings joy into your life. You can be in the most desperate of circumstances, but to have that is a source of joy. And throughout the difficulties, there was always something like that, which was a source of joy. And even through times that seemed so incredibly difficult, I realized that happiness is possible in this life. It's not something you have to wait for enlightenment for. And so I thank my dear, dear friends that helped make that possible. So, in preparing for this talk, I tried to think of a way to kind of tie everything together and think about how to tie it together with the Dharma and these life experiences. And I didn't end up writing anything. It just wasn't coming. But it so happened that this past week I was watching a video Dharma talk on YouTube, of all places, and came across part of this Dharma talk, which I think really sums up well what I was trying to prepare and write. So we're a little early, but in conclusion, what I'd like to do is read a short section of that Dharma talk, because I think it expresses well what I was trying to say. And this is by Ajahn Brahm, and he's the abbot of the Bodhinyana Monastery in Serpentine, Western Australia, and they're part of the Northern Thai forest tradition. And this was quite a ways into this video Dharma talk, but I decided to transcribe it, and so this is what Ajahn Brahm, part of what he said. Every experience has a Buddha nature, so it doesn't need to be rejected. It doesn't need to sound like, I'm going to get this out of the way and go back to real life. Otherwise, how many hours, days, months, years of your life are you wishing away? To get this out of the way, to do what you think life really is. If you're one of those people always wishing away hours, days, weeks, years of your life, you're missing out. You've only got so many years. You can't afford to waste even one day, 1 hour, 1 moment. So when you say every experience, every moment has Buddha nature, you're valuing everything, even the painful experiences. When you have to go to have chemotherapy or have some terrible operation, that has Buddha nature. That's important. These are opportunities for awakening. Your body is out of your control. You should know that by now. You just have to be with it. And the more you fight that body, the more you say, I don't want to be sick. I don't want to have that chemotherapy. I want to be better. As soon as you want something else, you're creating mental suffering. When you respect the experience you have as being part of things, and you don't discriminate between the nice experiences and the bad experiences, but you respect every experience, it's teaching you as a Buddha. It's a moment for awakening. Then you never try to wish away any part of your life. When you never wish away any part of your life, imagine how much peace, compassion, and wealth you have in your life. Everything is now respected. Thank you.
We have some time for questions.
Yeah. Feel free. Yes.
I was just tremendously moved by your talk, Tom. That was a wonderful teaching. And I just want to thank you. And you're talking about living in the orphanage as being suffering, one form of suffering. It's a horrible experience in a terrible place, but not nearly as bad as the second arrow, when you realized what a happy family life could be. That reflected back on that experience. It's a perfect demonstration of the first noble truth of suffering and the second noble truth of the cause of suffering.
Exactly.
That realization was the cause of suffering, and by the end of your life, finding joy and peace is the third noble truth. And I think your life is the example of the fourth noble truth, which is the path. So you could write a Dharma book, and it could be based on your life.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Yes?
You were talking a lot about painful experiences and how they gave you a perspective on impermanence. You didn't talk a lot about being gay. I was wondering, did you have a sense of any particular lessons coming out of being gay or coming out of the process? I mean, so many of us, I think, want the right to marry, or they want the right to be like straight people. Or I was thinking of that story when you were in the basement and you saw the father hug his son, and I want that. And I think a lot of us also have that sort of feeling. We want to have what the straight people have, but there's always a tension there about trying to make something happen that is, perhaps not ready to happen yet, or is beyond our control. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I think, my experience of coming out and realizing that I was gay, I think it wasn't too radically different than what many people experience at a young age. It's a coming of age story where you realize who you are and that you're different from other people, and coming to a point where you accept yourself as who you are. And so I don't think for me that process of my life was radically different than probably what many gay people experience. In terms of wanting to marry, I've never had a desire to do that. I have had several partners in my life, one for about 3 years and another for about 7, 8 years. This was the alcoholic, and he left me for a younger model. Probably a smart move. But we all remained friends. As a matter of fact, the three of us, his new lover and I, we all lived together for some time. We had a very, very friendly situation. He ended up dying from AIDS as well, and so his partner and I remained friends, and we stay in contact. But in terms of the marriage thing, it was just something that it never appealed to me, and it may be because that I never experienced the basis of family in the traditional sense. I never got to talk with my sisters during all the years that I lived in the orphanage, so we didn't have that bonding as this family unit. The time I spent with my mother was only a few years, so we didn't, and that was a pretty chaotic experience. So we didn't bond as family. So I didn't want those things. And as an adult, having a traditional, straight sort of existence was just not something that appealed to me. And it's probably just because of my life experiences. Does that answer your question?
Sort of, yeah.
Well, I mean, I'll talk more if you like. Tell me what you want to hear.
Everything you say has been very interesting. Well, I think it's just, you were talking so much about desire as the root of suffering, and I think that's such a crucial issue for us, to not allow ourselves to have any desire is also self-punishment, but to have too much desire or to bet all the chips, so to speak, on desire is also dangerous, so there's some kind of balance there, which is, I think, part of the essence of spiritual growth.
Of the experiences in my life, realizing that I'm gay and having that experience was probably one of the easier
hurdles.
So, yes.
I'm humbled by the sense of, I might be misinterpreting this, but the sense of equanimity that you were able to maintain a rather unusual and painful childhood. The life that you experience is something that I've read in novels, but I've never really talked to someone who actually lived that experience. Kind of very, very powerful.
Well, thank you. Yes?
I want to thank you, Don, for sharing your story. I really appreciate when, a lot of the Buddhist principles, the theories are demonstrated in actual everyday life situations. And what I really got out of your talk is that, it's not just that life is about suffering and includes suffering, but it's possible to overcome a lot of suffering. I feel you really...
Yes, and with that suffering there can be joy, and there is joy. Yes,
So thank you. I was very moved by it also. And the question I have to ask, I think, is a difficult question. At least I couldn't answer it. And that is there does suffering vary in degree, or is there just, are there worse and better, or is it?
I think for me, the worst suffering was when I came home from that family in West Hartford, because every day after that, I was in utter despair. And to me, that even laying on the bed and after the car wreck, not being homeless and wondering what I was going to do, that was not as bad as wishing for a family and parents and parents that love me. The heart attack and losing everything, it's all going to go anyway. So mine just left a little earlier than most people. My stuff. So I didn't really see that as serious suffering. But in terms of degrees of suffering, I think for me the most intense was after I saw the Promised Land, and I wanted to live there, and lived out my days realizing it wasn't going to happen. That was probably the most intense of suffering.
So the suffering is not, the degree of suffering is not determined directly, at least by the degree of pain, but rather what we do with it.
That and the level of desire. For me, before I knew about that, I desired something better. I had no clue as to what that would be or what it could be. But after that visit with that family, I then knew what was possible. And that desire ramped up from, boy, this could be better, to radically changing my entire perspective on life. And concomitant with that, suffering rose with it. The increase in desire really increased suffering. Answer your question?
Let's have one more question.
Yes.
Hi. Your mother sounds like a real live wire.
She was a wonder.
I'm just wondering if you think she found what she was looking for by coming to America, and what was the nature of your relationship?
It was very, very rocky. I think she was a product of the 50s, and when we were growing up, and in the 50s was an era of conformity, and so the expectation in society is that you love your children, and I think in that sort of overview, 50s sort of wanting to conform, I think she tried, but she didn't. In my view, I think her own needs always came first, and the person who really expressed love in our life was Aunt Hillary. She was devoted to us children. Even after we got out of the orphanage, she would take us every year, buy winter coats and clothes, and make sure we had really nice Christmas events, and would take us away for things. And she was a nurse in a hospital in West Hartford, and as I was a child, this is while I was living with my mother. She was riding home one night after a very long nursing shift, and ran into a divider embankment. This was back before the days; they were concrete in those days, back before they had and so she died instantly in that crash. Is another example of impermanence, where someone who's very, very important in your life can disappear like that. But in terms of my mother, I think she tried to love us, but was not successful. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Thank you, John. Do you have any announcements?
My name is Michael Murphy, and I'm coordinating the annual retreat. Registration is open as of today, and there are registration forms out on the credenza, which is a fancy word for table. One thing that's unique about this retreat is that it's a blend of kind of traditional forms of silent walking meditation and sitting meditation, but we also really have an opportunity to connect more deeply, tell each other our stories. So it's September 18th through the 20th at Vajrapani Institute, which is in the Santa Cruz Mountains. It's a really lovely place. Pretty much all you need to know is on this form, so check it out. If you have any questions, let me know. There is, scholarship money available. So if you have economic concerns, don't let that be a hindrance. Also, the registration form, thanks to our webmaster, Joe Kapulka, is on our website at gaybuddhist.org. If you click on the Retreats tab, there's a little narrative piece about the retreat with links to Vajrapani Institute and to a printable PDF of this form. So please consider coming, and you'll be hearing more announcements through the coming months. Thank you.
Other announcements?
I just wanted to tell people that next Saturday, the 18th, Reno Weissman is giving a one-day retreat for the LGBT queer community. She's the one that gives the annual 5 to 7 day retreat at Spirit Rock, and she's in town just for one day. It's 9:30 to 8 o'clock, and you can find out any information about it or sign up for it by going to the Spirit Rock website.
Let's see, Baruch here. So I'll mention that you probably all know we have a pen pal project where we write to inmates who are attempting to follow a Buddhist path, which will also happen to be gay. And so just to announce that we now have a website that Don actually put up for us.
Well, it's not up.
It's not up.
Yeah, we put it up, and there was some concern by the Zen Center that they weren't participatory in its design, so it was taken down and yeah. I think what's going to happen is Jeffrey Snyder is going to be becoming involved in that, and the thinking was that he should be involved in the content, and so
all things are impermanent.
Exactly. So it was up for maybe a couple days, and then the Zen Center decided that, or kind of expressed an interest in participating more in what should be there. So, sorry about that.
But speaking of the prison project, there is going to be a book sale at the Zen Center starting August 1st and going for about a week. And I think they have thousands of books. It's a really good book sale, and all the proceeds go towards the prisoner project. We buy books and send articles and provide Dharma materials to people that are incarcerated. So check out the book sale, and before then, donate books to the Zen Center if you have anything you want to know.
Any other announcements? Okay, do we have a host?
We have treats, both sweet and healthy sweet. There's tea. If you do have some tea, could you please rinse out your cup? I'll be coming around with a Dharma bowl, and whatever you can give would be greatly appreciated. And there's also a sign-up list on that table or credenza if you want to get on our mailing list.
All right, let's gather in a circle for closing.
May the power and truth of this practice, by the power and truth of this practice, may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all be free from sorrow and the causes of sorrow. May all never be separated from the sacred happiness which is without sorrow, and may all live in equanimity without too much attachment or too much aversion, and live believing in the equality of all that lives.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.